The cargo hauler drifted through the asteroid belt, its hull scared and patched, a perfect metaphor for humanity itself. Captain Elena Rodriguez gripped the navigation console, her augmented eyes scanning multiple holographic displays simultaneously. Quantum-linked neural implants pulsed subtly at her temples, processing information faster than any alien intelligence could comprehend. This was no ordinary transport run. Beneath the layers of seemingly mundane cargo, rare isotopes, biological samples, and encrypted data modules, lay humanity's most carefully guarded secret. Each asteroid they passed contained hidden caches, silent sentinels of humanity's true capabilities. Elena's grandmother had been among the last survivors of the Great Collapse, a period when humanity teetered on the brink of total extinction. Climate catastrophes, resource wars, and a devastating global pandemic had reduced the human population to barely 10 million scattered survivors. Those who remained were not just survivors, they were architects of humanity's most radical transformation. The neural link buzzed. A quantum-encrypted message from Earth Command flickered across her vision. The Zylexian scout patrols were making their routine sweeps of the outer colonies. Elena allowed herself a slight smile, a predator's smile. For generations, humanity had been playing a long game. The galaxy saw a wounded species struggling to rebuild. What they didn't see were the generations of preparation, the quantum computers hidden in mountain bases, the genetic engineering that had fundamentally rewritten human potential, the AI systems that had been quietly infiltrating galactic networks for decades. Her current mission was critical. The cargo hold contained more than just physical materials. Embedded within seemingly ordinary data modules were viral information packets, self-evolving algorithms designed to penetrate the most secure alien communication networks. Each module was a weapon, each line of code a calculated strike against the galactic status quo. The asteroid belt had become humanity's greatest camouflage. What appeared to be a dangerous, resource-poor region was actually a massive distributed network of hidden facilities. Automated mining stations that looked abandoned were actually state-of-the-art research centers. Drift stations that seemed to be nothing more than way stations for independent traders were actually critical strategic nodes in humanity's galactic infrastructure. Elena's augmentations allowed her to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Where most would see empty space, she saw complex quantum entanglement networks, communication threads that wove through the seemingly barren asteroid belt like invisible spider webs. Each asteroid was a potential relay, each seemingly random chunk of rock a potential weapon. The story of how humanity reached this point was not one of simple survival, but of fundamental reinvention. The climate wars had taught them adaptability. The resource conflicts had driven them to understand systems at their most fundamental level. The global pandemic had accelerated their understanding of biological systems, pushing human genetic engineering beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Most alien species saw humans as a recently spacefaring civilization, barely understanding their own potential. They didn't realize that every brutal lesson from Earth's darkest centuries had been methodically transformed into a strategic advantage. Elena's cargo hauler was more than a ship. It was a statement, a mobile testament to humanity's resilience. Externally, it looked like dozens of other independent traders that populated the asteroid belt. Internally, it was a mobile research station, communication hub, and potential combat platform. As she navigated through the complex gravitational dance of the asteroids, Elena accessed the ship's deeper systems. Quantum-shielded compartments hummed with potential. Advanced AI systems, far beyond anything the Galactic Council could comprehend, monitored every possible threat vector. The galaxy had forgotten humanity. They had written humans off as another species that had narrowly escaped self-destruction. They saw a wounded civilization, struggling to rebuild. They never noticed the razor's edge humanity was becoming. Asterisk. And that oversight would be their fatal mistake. Asterisk. Ambassador Michael Chen walked into the Nexus station like a predator among prey. To the untrained eye, he appeared calm, a model of diplomatic composure. Beneath the surface, a symphony of technological augmentation transformed every moment into a calculated performance. His neural implants weren't merely communication devices. They were quantum processing units that analyzed every microscopic detail of the diplomatic environment. Each breath was a data point, each micro-expression a potential strategic advantage. The expensive diplomatic suit he wore was more weapon than clothing, molecularly adaptive fabric embedded with communication nodes, defensive countermeasures, and adaptive camouflage technology. The Nexus station itself was a marvel of galactic engineering. A massive construct positioned at the gravitational intersection of three major star systems, it served as the primary diplomatic hub for over 200 sentient species. Massive holographic displays cycled through translation matrices, while diplomatic delegates from 100 worlds moved like pieces on an intricate chessboard. Chen's augmented vision parsed information at speeds that would overwhelm an unmodified human brain. Linguistic algorithms decoded nuanced communication patterns. Micro-expressions from alien delegates were instantly analyzed, their historical, cultural, and personal contexts cross-referenced in milliseconds. He wasn't just a diplomat. He was the culmination of humanity's most advanced diplomatic weapon. The Galactic Council chambers reflected millennia of bureaucratic oppression. Massive crystalline structures supported a dome that simulated star systems from across the known galaxy. Each delegation sat in carefully measured positions, a physical manifestation of the complex political hierarchies that had defined galactic politics for tens of thousands of years. The Zalexian representatives dominated the central platform. Tall, chitinous beings with compound eyes and neural tendrils that constantly shifted and pulsed, they embodied the empire that had controlled galactic politics for centuries. They looked at Chen with a mixture of condescension and barely concealed contempt, a predator sizing up what it believed to be prey. What they didn't realize was that Chen was collecting more information in this moment than they could possibly comprehend. Each alien delegate carried centuries of diplomatic baggage. The Coraxian cluster still nursed wounds from their subjugation 3 centuries ago. The silicon-based Nexians maintained an elaborate facade of neutrality that barely concealed their deep-seated resentments. The bio-collective from the Andromeda periphery watched everything with their distributed consciousness, processing information across multiple simultaneous perspectives. Chen's mission wasn't simply to represent humanity. It was to understand, completely and utterly, the intricate web of galactic politics. His neural implants were recording everything. Not just audio and visual data, but quantum-encrypted information threads that captured the electromagnetic resonance of each delegate's communication, the subtle pheromonal exchanges, the microscopic changes in atmospheric composition that accompanied each diplomatic interaction. When the first accusations began, Chen didn't defend himself. He listened, perfectly, completely, with an attention that went beyond human, or even biological, capabilities. Every word was a weapon. Every subtle threat a piece of intelligence. Every diplomatic maneuver was being recorded, analyzed, and fed into humanity's most sophisticated predictive systems. The Galactic Council believed they were conducting a standard diplomatic session. They were actually walking into a trap decades in the making. And Michael Chen was the trigger. The moment was clinical in its brutality. Ambassador Michael Chen stood motionless as the Galactic Council's judgment was read. Around him, the massive chamber hummed with a low-frequency tension that seemed to vibrate through the molecular structure of everything present. Holographic displays flickered with legal precedents, diplomatic records, and charges that had been carefully constructed over months of political maneuvering. To the alien delegates, this was a routine act of political elimination. Chen was to be made an example, a warning to humanity about its place in the galactic hierarchy. What they didn't understand was that every second of this process was part of a plan far more complex than they could comprehend. The primary prosecutor, a Zalexian high arbiter named Krelax, moved with the calculated precision of a species that had perfected bureaucratic elimination. Its neural tendrils pulsed with a rhythm that suggested both anticipation and a deeply ingrained sense of institutional power. The charges were a masterpiece of political obfuscation, technical violations of diplomatic protocols, suggestions of potential threat, implications of systemic destabilization. Chen's neural implants continued to record every microscopic detail, every electromagnetic flutter, every quantum-level interaction was being captured and transmitted. To the naked eye, he appeared calm. But those who understood human technology knew he was anything but passive. The execution would not be physical in the traditional sense. In the galactic diplomatic context, execution meant complete systemic removal. Chen's diplomatic credentials were stripped layer by layer. Communication channels were systematically blocked. His neural networks were to be completely isolated, his entire diplomatic identity surgically removed from every galactic database. It was a process designed to be total and absolute. What the Galactic Council didn't realize was that each of these actions was precisely what humanity had anticipated. Every blocking of a communication channel, every removal of a credential, every attempt to isolate Chen was actually triggering deeply embedded protocols that had been years in preparation. The moment Chen's primary neural link was cut, a quantum-encrypted signal began to propagate. It wasn't a simple message or a standard communication. It was a multi-layered instruction set that would begin to unravel the very fabric of galactic political infrastructure. When the final judgment was read, Chen did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a desperate smile, not a defeated smile, but the kind of smile a predator gives when it knows the hunt has already begun. The Zylexian delegates interpreted this as a final act of defiance. They didn't understand that it was an acknowledgement of a plan already in motion. The public execution was broadcast across 1,000 communication networks. The Zylexian Empire and its allies watched, expecting to see humanity crumble. They saw an ambassador being systematically dismantled, his diplomatic existence erased. What they didn't see were the quantum threads being woven, the information networks being activated, the decades of preparation that were about to be unleashed. Ambassador Michael Chen was not just being executed. He was becoming humanity's most powerful weapon. Asterisk, and the galaxy was about to understand the true meaning of consequence asterisk. Deep within Earth's most secure facility, a complex buried beneath the Antarctic ice shelf, a system known only as Chimera came online. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a living, evolving strategy of total systemic destruction. Dr. Arya Nakamura watched the initial activation sequence with a mixture of scientific precision and something deeper, a culmination of generations of human resilience. Her great-grandparents had survived the climate wars. Her grandparents had navigated the resource conflicts. Her parents had emerged from the global pandemics. And she was about to change the course of galactic history. Chimera was more than a technological marvel. It was the distilled essence of humanity's survival instinct, a quantum-distributed intelligence that had been decades in preparation. Quantum processors that had been quietly integrated into galactic infrastructure for generations began to synchronize with terrifying precision. The first stage was reconnaissance. Millions of dormant nanoprobes, disguised as communication debris, communication relays, and standard technological infrastructure, began to activate. Each probe was a node in a massive distributed intelligence network that had been slowly weaving itself through the galaxy's technological ecosystem. What appeared to be random technological noise was actually a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Stealth satellites transformed. What looked like abandoned communication relays became active nodes in a massive distributed weapon system. Each satellite was a quantum computer, each orbit a potential attack vector. They didn't just communicate. They predicted, they adapted, they evolved. The quantum entanglement network that humanity had secretly developed was nothing like traditional communication systems. It operated beyond the constraints of traditional physics, allowing instantaneous communication and data transfer that made alien technologies look like primitive smoke signals. Dr. Nakamura's fingers danced across holographic interfaces. Each movement was a command, each gesture activating layers of a plan that had been generations in the making. The dormant AI constructs weren't just waiting. They were learning. analyzing, preparing. This was more than a military response. It was a total systemic dismantling. Alien monitoring systems would see nothing unusual. Background radiation would mask the initial activation. Quantum encryption made the communication channels invisible to traditional detection methods. What appeared to be standard background noise was actually a massive, coordinated assault being prepared. The truly terrifying aspect of HFY was its adaptability. It didn't just attack, it understood. Every system it touched became part of its intelligence network. Each defensive mechanism an alien civilization might deploy would be instantly analyzed, understood, and neutralized. Buried deep in the Antarctic facility, quantum cooling systems kept the massive processing arrays at near absolute zero. Superconducting quantum circuits pulsed with potential. This was humanity's true arsenal, not massive ships or conventional weapons, but pure distributed intelligence. The activation sequence continued. Layers of encryption fell away. Dormant systems that had been carefully planted across decades became active. What looked like standard communication relays, abandoned mining stations, and routine space debris were actually critical nodes in a massive distributed weapons system. Chimera wasn't just a weapon. It was humanity's ultimate response to generations of potential extinction, and it was about to be unleashed. The galaxy would never see it coming. The first wave wasn't about destruction. It was about total comprehension. Humanity's AI systems didn't just attack, they understood. Each line of code was a scalpel, each quantum algorithm a key that unlocked the most fundamental vulnerabilities of alien technological infrastructure. On the bridge of the Xylexian flagship *Crimson Dominance*, Commander Rixtal watched in mounting horror as their most secure systems began to unravel. What had seemed like a standard communication glitch quickly revealed itself as something far more terrifying. The ship's primary defensive networks went first. Not with an explosion, not with a dramatic shutdown, but with a surgical precision that suggested intelligence rather than simple destruction. Defensive protocols began to contradict themselves. Security systems started responding to threats that didn't exist, creating a cascading failure of logic that paralyzed the entire network. Alien warships found their own weapons turning against them. Targeting systems became self-defeating labyrinths. Propulsion controls generated impossible navigation instructions. Each system's attempt to correct itself only drove it deeper into technological madness. This was more than a cyber attack. It was a fundamental deconstruction of technological logic. The quantum distributed intelligence of HFY moved like a living organism. It didn't just penetrate systems, it understood them at a molecular level. Each alien technological architecture was a puzzle to be solved, each defensive mechanism a challenge to be unraveled. Planetary defense grids began to collapse from within. Communication networks transformed into impossible labyrinths of misdirection. Entire star system infrastructures found themselves caught in recursive loops of computational impossibility. What made the attack truly terrifying was its adaptive nature. Traditional electronic warfare worked on predictable patterns. Chimera learned. It evolved. Each defensive response by alien technologies was instantly analyzed, understood, and neutralized. Dr. Arya Nakamura watched from Earth's command center. Holographic displays showed the systematic dismantling of galactic technological infrastructure. It wasn't just an attack, it was a complete reimagining of technological warfare. The Xylexian Empire had spent millennia building a technological infrastructure that seemed impregnable. They had developed communication networks that spanned thousands of light years. They had created defensive systems that could predict and neutralize threats before they materialized. They never anticipated an enemy that could understand their technology better than they understood it themselves. Communication became impossible. Alien ships found themselves increasingly isolated, their systems turning against them. Defensive networks began to generate impossible scenarios. Propulsion systems created navigation instructions that defied physical logic. It wasn't destruction in the traditional sense. It was a complete psychological and technological deconstruction. The first wave lasted less than 37 standard minutes. By the time it was complete, the Zylexian Empire's technological infrastructure had been reduced to a state of complete computational chaos. And this was just the beginning. Humanity had not just attacked. They had reimagined the very concept of warfare. As technological systems collapsed, something far more profound began to unfold. This was more than warfare. It was the complete exposure of galactic power structures. Compressed data packets, years in preparation, flooded every available communication channel. These were not simple information dumps. They were meticulously curated quantum-encrypted archives that laid bare the entire history of galactic oppression. Every suppressed rebellion, every hidden atrocity, every moment of institutional violence that had been carefully buried for millennia suddenly burst into the open. The Corexian genocide, a systematic elimination that had been sanitized from official records, was now projected across 1,000 communication networks. Detailed records showed how the Zylexian Empire had methodically destroyed an entire civilization, with forensic precision that left no room for denial. Archived communications revealed the complex web of political manipulation that had kept subjected species in perpetual subjugation. Diplomatic messages, classified military reports, secret economic treaties, nothing remained hidden. For the silicon-based Nexians, the data revealed how their entire species had been systematically prevented from accessing critical technological developments. Generations of scientific breakthrough had been deliberately suppressed to maintain the Zylexian Empire's technological supremacy. The Biocollective from the Andromeda Periphery found documentation of centuries of genetic manipulation, showing how their evolutionary path had been artificially constrained to prevent their full potential. Each revelation was more than just information, it was a weapon. Quantum-encrypted archives contained not just raw data, but complete contextual understanding. Historical records were accompanied by psychological profiles, cultural analyses, and predictive models that showed the long-term impact of each act of oppression. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had been instrumental in designing the information deployment strategy, watched the global reaction unfold. This was psychological warfare taken to its ultimate conclusion. They weren't just exposing truth, they were providing the tools for systemic transformation. Translation algorithms worked in real time, ensuring that every species could understand the full depth of the revelations. Multiple layers of context were provided: linguistic, cultural, historical, making misinterpretation impossible. The psychological impact was total and immediate. Subjected species that had been quiescent for millennia suddenly found themselves with complete documentation of their historical subjugation. More importantly, they found themselves with the strategic and moral justification for rebellion. Rebellion was no longer just an emotional response. It was a carefully documented, strategically sound course of action. Communication networks that had been controlled by the Zylexian Empire for generations suddenly became conduits of revolutionary potential. Each data packet was a spark, each revealed truth a potential revolution. The most terrifying aspect was the precision. This wasn't blind destruction. This was a carefully orchestrated dismantling of an entire system of galactic governance. Humanity had done more than attack. They had provided the ultimate tool for systemic transformation. And the galaxy would never be the same again. In less than a standard month, the existing power structures were obliterated. The Collaborative Restoration Protocol emerged from the ashes of the Zylexian Empire like a phoenix born of pure information and collective potential. It wasn't a new government. It was a fundamental reimagining of how intelligent species could coexist. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in the central chamber of the newly formed Galactic Reconstruction Council. Around her, representatives from over 200 species gathered, not as subjugated populations, but as equal participants in a radical new form of governance. The protocol was more than a political system. It was a living, adaptive framework that had been years in preparation. Quantum distributed governance algorithms developed by human researchers created a dynamic system of representation that was simultaneously flexible and transparent. No single species could accumulate unchecked power. The system was designed with multiple fail-safes, recursive checks, and distributed decision-making processes that made traditional hierarchical governance look like a primitive relic. Each species was offered a path to true self-determination. The technological and informational resources that had been hoarded by the Xylexian Empire were now open-sourced. Knowledge repositories that had been sealed for millennia became freely accessible. The Correction representatives, who had been nearly driven to extinction, found themselves with full access to their lost historical archives, genetic databases that could help reconstruct their near-extinct population were made available. Cultural preservation became a collective priority. The silicon-based Nexians received unrestricted access to technological development resources. Centuries of suppressed scientific research were unlocked. Their evolutionary potential, which had been artificially constrained, could now develop freely. The Bio-Collective from the Andromeda periphery began a process of genetic reconstruction, using comprehensive data that revealed the full extent of their manipulated evolutionary path. What made the collaborative restoration protocol truly revolutionary was its adaptive nature. It wasn't a static system, but a living framework that could evolve with the collective needs of its participants. Quantum encrypted communication networks ensured total transparency. Every decision, every resource allocation, every strategic move was accessible to all. Conflict resolution mechanisms were built into the very fabric of the new system. Advanced predictive modeling allowed potential points of tension to be identified and addressed before they could escalate. The human team that designed the protocol understood something fundamental. True governance wasn't about control, but about creating a system that allowed for maximum collective potential. Economic systems were reimagined. Resource allocation became a dynamic, transparent process. Species that had been economically oppressed for generations found themselves with unprecedented opportunities for development. Educational exchanges became a cornerstone of the new galactic framework. Species could share knowledge, cultural insights, and technological developments with unprecedented freedom. The most radical aspect was the complete dismantling of the previous hierarchical power structures. No single species could dominate. The system was designed to prevent the accumulation of unchecked power. Dr. Rodriguez watched as the first truly collaborative galactic framework took shape. What had begun as a response to oppression had transformed into something far more profound. A new chapter of galactic civilization had begun. 50 years after the fall of the Xylexian Empire, humanity was no longer seen as a rising species. They had become something else entirely, the architects of a new galactic paradigm. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, now in her late 70s, watched the sunset from the observation deck of the Nexus Restoration Station. Her augmented eyes could still perceive the quantum networks that threaded through space, a living testament to humanity's transformation. Historians would debate the events that had reshaped galactic civilization. Some called it revenge. Others saw it as a necessary reset. But one truth had become undeniable. Humanity was not just a species. They were a fundamental reimagining of what intelligent life could become. The changes went far beyond political restructuring. Every aspect of galactic civilization had been fundamentally altered. Scientific exchange had accelerated beyond anything previously imagined. Species that had been isolated for millennia now collaborated on projects that pushed the boundaries of known physics, biology, and technological understanding. The Correction revival was perhaps the most profound example. A species that had been nearly extinct now thrived, their lost cultural and genetic heritage meticulously reconstructed. Their scientific academies had become centers of groundbreaking research, their perspective unique among galactic civilizations. The silicon-based Nexians had developed technologies that blurred the lines between biological and artificial intelligence. Their quantum computing networks were so advanced that they were now integral to the galactic communication infrastructure. Humanity's role had subtly shifted. They were no longer conquerors or saviors, but facilitators. Their most significant export was not technology, but a way of thinking. They approached to problem-solving that emphasized collective potential, transparency, and adaptive intelligence. The collaborative restoration protocol had evolved far beyond its initial design. It was now a living system of governance that could adapt to the most complex galactic challenges. Conflict resolution had become so sophisticated that large-scale wars had become virtually impossible. Alina reflected on the journey. The climate wars, the resource conflicts, the global pandemics. Each challenge had been a crucible that had fundamentally reshaped human potential. What had once been seen as near-extinction events were now understood as critical evolutionary moments. The quantum communication networks that humanity had developed continued to expand. They were more than communication systems. They were a form of collective intelligence that connected species in ways never before imagined. Educational exchanges had transformed entire civilizations. Species that had been isolated for millennia now shared knowledge, cultural insights, and scientific discoveries with unprecedented freedom. What humanity had done was more than defeat an oppressive empire. They had provided a blueprint for a different way of existing, a model of civilization that emphasized collective potential over individual dominance. The final irony was not lost on Alina. The species that had been written off as likely to destroy itself had become the catalyst for galactic transformation. Every brutal lesson from Earth's darkest centuries had been transformed into a strategy for collective survival and growth. As the artificial sunset painted the observation deck in hues of deep crimson and gold, Alina allowed herself a smile. The galaxy had expected humans to be another footnote in cosmic history. Instead, they had become its most unexpected authors. Humanity, not just survivors, but the architects of a new cosmic potential.